Good evening. Hello, my holy sisters and brothers. How are you? Isn't that fun music? I love it. That's Rabbi Shlomo Katz singing Nigun Mitzpi. It's Thursday night. We're getting in a Shabbos frame of mind. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we do a little learning here near the very end? We're so close to the end of Tractate Eruvin. Who's going to be with us this evening? Yehudit from Florence, South Carolina. Melissa from Great Neck. James from Indianapolis. Pauline from Arkansas. Paula from Chicago. Chaim says a good Erev Shabbos. John is with us from Sedona. Wilson says Boston is here tonight. Chaim with us from Charlotte. Shmuela from Tacoma, Washington. Rochelle from Modesto. Ladybug, says Shalom from New Jersey. Sharon says Shalom from Lebanon, New Jersey. Please a Misha Bayrak for my dear friend Moshe Shlomo ben Sarah Rivka in the ICU with a head injury. My friends, please join us in davening and praying for refuah shlema, complete recovery of body, mind, spirit, complete recovery for Moshe Shlomo ben Sarah Rivka, and we say Amen. Pauline says, please pray for my friend Joan, who is having surgery tomorrow. May Joan have a complete and speedy recovery, and we say Amen. Molly with us from Nova Scotia. Jeff says New England, says Shalom. James loves the hat. We're breaking out the hat. We're going to be talking about, could we wear such a hat on Shabbos? We'll be talking about that in today's daf. We've been talking about construction and fences and partitions and tents. How are we getting to a hat? You will see later in today's show. Nancy from Southern Pines, North Carolina. Helena is with us from Finland. Love the flag, Helena. Sammy from Dallas. Ladybug from New Jersey. Janice from Dallas. Linda from Florida. Tomadon from and Heidi Shori says Shalom from Tucson. Over there on the YouTube side, Marjorie with us from Tucker, Georgia. Lindsay says Shalom Aleichem from Cincinnati. Lynn with us from North Texas. And Lucy Johnson says Shalom from Minnesota, where I got to imagine is getting dark early and starting to get cold. May the light of Torah coming from California bring warmth to all our dear friends who are in northern and getting colder climates. Welcome, everybody. Okay, we're getting so close to the end of Tractate Eruvin. Our siyum, our completion, is scheduled for Sunday. With God's help, we'll all be together. The regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Bring a l'chaim, something to drink, a little something to nosh, something to eat so we can make a bracha, make a blessing. Usually some kind of a grain product, a pastry, a cookie, a muffin, something like that. In addition to a little l'chaim, something to drink. If alcohol is okay by you, a little bourbon, a little whiskey would be nice. If not, not necessary at all. We'll finish Tractate Eruvin with God's help and read the first few lines of the next tractate in the Talmud. That's Pesachim, the laws of Passover. Here, where are we holding? This is Daf Kuf Beis. That's Daf 102, page 102 here in Tractate Eruvin. There are 105 pages. We're in chapter 10. The sages are throwing in all kinds of, somewhat miscellany, like a lot of little rulings and small discussions here at the end of the chapter. Today, we're talking about Mishnahs 12, 13, and 14. There are 19 Mishnahs in this chapter 10, the final chapter of Tractate Eruvin. Let's get into it. We are going to be talking about locks and hinges and hats. Oh my. Okay. Let's read the first Mishnah of today's discussion. This is Mishnah number 12. With regard to a bolt that is attached to the door, but owing to the length of the rope, it does not hang from the door, but drags along the ground, one may lock a door with it in the temple on Shabbos, as this is prohibited only by a rabbinic decree issued to enhance the character of Shabbos as a day of rest, and rabbinic decrees are not in effect in the temple. However, one may not lock a door with this bolt in the country outside the temple. This is a distinction we've seen just a little bit before, but not in quite a lot of pages. There's been a lot of pages since we've seen this distinction, a law of something that is permitted to do in the Holy Temple when the temple is standing in Jerusalem. It's been a couple thousand years since that was so. But when the Messiah comes, the third temple will come up like that. And there are going to be certain laws that apply everywhere else, but not in the temple. We'll discuss that in a moment. And with regard to one that is not tied at all, but rests entirely on the ground, it is prohibited in both places, in and outside the temple, as the use of this bolt is considered building. Rabbi Yehuda says one that rests entirely on the ground is permitted in the temple, and one that drags along the ground is permitted even in the rest of the country. Rabbi Yehuda is more lenient than the other sages. All right, we're not going to discuss every nook and cranny, every nuance of this law, but here's a nice little illustration that gives us a sense of what we're talking about here. The basic concept is that on Shabbos, we're not allowed to engage in construction. In fact, there are 39 prohibited labors on Shabbos. They are the labors that were necessary to create the tabernacle, the Mishkan, in the desert when the children of Israel were wandering through the desert. And the Mishkan was the place of bringing the sacrifices. It was eventually replaced by the temple. But even though we used it 40 years in the temple, in the desert, we continued to use it for 400 years when the children of Israel first settled the land of Israel. Eventually, King David came and he sort of chose the spot and raised a lot of, funds, began the capital campaign, etc. And it fell to his son, Solomon, King Solomon, who actually built the first temple. Okay, but in the temple where the Kohanim, the priests, are in charge, okay? So the Kohanim are very well immersed in the laws of the Torah, and they don't need the sages to issue further rabbinic decrees to protect them from coming to violate Torah prohibitions. There actually are some rabbinic decrees that even apply in the temple. So this distinction is not always so, that if it's a rabbinic decree, it applies outside the temple. It does not apply in the temple grounds, whereas Torah laws apply in and out of the temple and everywhere. But there are many rabbinic decrees that apply, everywhere else, but not on the temple grounds, where the priests who administrate that area, they're in charge. They don't need further rabbinic decrees to protect them from coming to violate Torah prohibitions. So one of these important categories of prohibitions are to protect people from coming to violate the Torah prohibition on construction. We cannot build on Shabbos or do anything that resembles construction. We've been talking quite a bit about that in the last few days. Yesterday, we even discussed that you wouldn't build a pile of wood. This would be on a festival when you can cook food. But when you arrange the wood, you would be careful not to arrange the wood in such a way that you could technically be considered as building a structure. And that's what we saw. I think it was Rabbi Eliezer would hold the wood up and then slide in the pieces underneath it. So he was building from the top down, kind of awkward, unusual way to build, but just so that it would be clear that he wasn't trying to build a structure on Shabbos. We've talked a little bit already about bolts in a door. And in the old days, they didn't have these fancy locking mechanisms with springs and gears and screws attached to the door that sends a bolt, flying out from the middle of the door into the door frame. When they were locking a door, they would often just stick a bolt in a hole in the ground behind the door. So now you can't open the door because there's this iron rod that's in a hole right behind the door. So the question is, if you put an iron rod in this hole that is going to stop the door from opening, did you just commit an act of construction which would be prohibited on Shabbos? So the sages are going to distinguish between different ways of putting that bolt in the ground, different ways of holding that bolt when it's not being used, when the door is not locked, as it were. Now, this little illustration is pretty good. So here's three. The bolts are yellow, as you can see, and there's the door. So there's two doors there. One bolt is attached to the door, and it's hanging in the air, so it's not touching the ground when it's not in use, when it's not stuck in that hole in the bottom. That's definitely going to be permitted. Then there's a bolt that's just leaning against the wall. That's not attached to the door or the house or anything. It's just kind of leaning there, waiting to be stuck into the hole. Where there's going to be a dispute whether that's permitted or not. Some will say that's prohibited everywhere to do on Shabbos. Some will say that's permitted in the temple, but prohibited outside the temple. And then there's the bolt over there on that door, which is attached to the door, the sort of one in back. It's attached to the door, but it's hanging in such a way that it's on the ground. It's attached to the door, but it's not well attached to the door. So it's dragging along the ground or hanging on the ground when it's not in use. And there's going to be some disagreement about whether or not that is prohibited. So that gives you a little bit of a picture of what we're talking about. Generally speaking, we're seeing that Rabbi Yehuda in these cases is going to be more lenient than the other sages. So the Gemara right away brings a baraisa, which says, okay, what does it mean that the bolt drags along the ground, right? Because in the Mishna, there was a distinction about a bolt that drags along the ground. The sages said that if it's attached to the door, but it drags on the ground, they can use that in the temple, but not elsewhere, because it's too much like construction. It's a rabbinic decree, but it's too similar to construction. And Rabbi Yehuda will say, no, you could do that everywhere. The one that drags, the one that you can only do in the temple is the bolt that's sitting on the ground when it is not in use. Okay, so now the Gemara asks, well, what do we mean by it drags on the ground? Like I just showed you an illustration, but that's, people have sort of come to understand it that way because of this discussion that comes in the Gemara. In the Mishnah, it just says a bolt that drags. So what does it mean, a bolt that drags, right? Remember, when I read you the Mishnah, I'm not reading it as it's originally written in the Mishnah. I'm also adding some words that are elucidated by Rav Steinsaltz. The Mishnah itself is not written with words like it can be done in the temple on Shabbos, as this is prohibited only by rabbinic decree. That's all part of the elucidation. If we were really only reading the Mishnah, it would say, a bolt that drags, one locks with it in the temple. However, in the country, no. Right? So that's how terse the Mishnah is. And when I read it to you, it's always a little bit with an elucidation so that we can understand it better. So now the Gemara asks, well, what is a bolt that drags? And it brings a baraisa and it says, okay, a bolt that drags is one that is tied and suspended. It's tied to the door. It's hanging on the door, so it's suspended. And it reaches the ground, right? You could tie it to the door with a rope, and it's hanging on the door from its hook on the door, but it doesn't reach the ground. So one that drags is one that does reach the ground. And so Rabbi Yehuda would say this is permitted everywhere, rather than say it's okay in the temple, but a bar without a knob that rests in the corner, this is going to be prohibited everywhere, right? Even according to Rabbi Yehuda. Then Rav Yehuda, in the name of Shmuel, says the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. So right here we have a clear distinction between Rav Yehuda, who's a later rabbi, and Rabbi Yehuda, who's an earlier rabbi of the Mishnaic period. So there's going to be a lot of discussion of what's permitted and what's not. I'm just going to read you where the law comes out in terms of these bolts that are tied to the door and that drag. So the halacha is a bolt that drags. If a bolt that does not have a knob at its end, why is it important that it doesn't have a knob? Because if it has a knob on the end, then the bolt itself is a utensil. And we're going to be more flexible with that because the bolt could be used, maybe to crack nuts or to stir food or do something with it, which is not necessarily related to construction in any way. Excuse me. What's going on here? Sorry about that. My computer is fading out because the plug got pulled. Sorry. And I just need to be able to monitor what's going on. Okay. All right. So that's the law. A bolt that does not have a knob on its end, if a bolt that does not have a knob on its end is attached to a door, it is permitted to lock the door with it, even if it rests entirely on the ground. The bolt can rest on the ground, but it has to be attached to the door in order to be used. Otherwise, it becomes like construction if we use it, because it's like we're attaching this bolt into a spot on the ground. It's going to hold the door. That's a little bit too much like construction. Okay. Rav Avia saw a bolt that was tied to the door. Somebody was tying a bolt to the door, but he wasn't using a nice piece of rope or leather to attach the bolt to the door. He was just using a grass reed. And he said, that's no good, right? So this was too much of a symbolic attachment of the bolt to the door. It has to really be attached to the door. If it's just a symbolic attachment, that's not going to work. And he ruled that was no good. In the house of Rabbi Pedat, there was a crossbeam that they used. They had this big beam, right? Like a massive piece of wood. And what they would do is they would drag it in front of the door. So when this thing was on the floor sitting in front of the door, you couldn't open the door because it was so massive that it actually required 10 men to move it, right? So imagine this thing, a beam that requires 10 men to move it, and they're going to place that in front of the door so that at night the bad guys can't open the door. They can't push this door open. Is that going to be okay? It says that Rabbi Pedat, it was in his house. He allowed this to happen. How could this be allowed? Doesn't it seem like it's construction? Well, even though it's a big, heavy piece of wood, it's not being attached to anything. It's not being inserted in anything. It's just sitting there in front of the door. And a big piece of wood is a utensil. It can be used for things on Shabbos. It can be moved. Why? Because we could sit on it. We could use it like a chair or a bench, right? You can move chairs and furniture around on Shabbos. You should try not to exert yourself. Maybe that's why they use 10 men, so that no one man is really using, he's not lifting too much weight. But that's going to be permitted. And likewise, Mar Shmuel, in his house, he had a giant mortar, right? So a mortar and pestle is something that we grind in. Now, grinding is definitely not allowed on Shabbos, but a mortar is really, it's a bowl. It's basically a bowl made out of a good hard material. And a bowl is a vessel that's certainly permissible to use on Shabbos. This one was massive. So imagine like a bowl like this big, maybe even bigger. And they would drag that in front of the door to keep the door closed. Was it permitted? Yes, because they weren't engaged in any kind of construction. The mortar is a vessel. It's permitted to touch and move and use a vessel on Shabbos. And they just moved it in front of the door, and that was going to be okay. And now that we're talking about construction, we sort of take a little digression related to construction, but instead of talking about doors and bolts and locks, etc., we're going to talk for a second about tents. And how do we get over there? It says, Rami Bar Yecheskel sent a request to Rav Amram. Let the master tell us some of those outstanding matters that you told us in the name of Rav Asi with regard to the arches of a boat. Right? That's what he said. Teach us this, what you said about the arches of a boat. So I don't have a picture of this, but I mean in color, but if you could see this boat right here, hopefully that's clear enough, even though it's out of focus. This boat has arches on it, like sort of thin, wooden, flexible, rods that arch over the boat. You can also, if you have a picture in your mind of the covered wagons, right, that people used to the westward expansion of the United States in the 1800s, and what held up the covered wagon, right? What held up that canvas were these flexible, dowels of wood or slats of wood that went up and bent and came down, and you could hang cloth over it. Likewise, you could do that with boats. So the question is, could you spread mats over those flexible wooden slats that are acting as arches? Could you take reed mats, right, like the kind of mats that we use at the beach now, a reed mat, and put it over those slats to, so that you would have shade on Shabbos? Now, it's very similar to erecting a tent on Shabbos, which we cannot do. We can't even open an umbrella because that's like erecting a tent on Shabbos. You can't put up a tent. However, if you have a tent, you can add a little bit to it so that there's more shade than there was before. And that's what the teaching is. So where am I? So the teaching is you can't build a tent, but you can expand a tent that's already there. So what do you do with these arches? First of all, they have to be at least 1 handbreadth wide. That makes them significant. Or if the arches are within 3 handbreadths of each other, it's like they're continuous. What you should do is put at least 1 mat over the arches before Shabbos started on Friday afternoon, let's say. And then on Shabbos, it turns out it's sunnier than you expected, or you have more people than you expected, whatever the thing. You can put more mats there and have a bigger shady area because you're not putting up a tent. You're just adding a little bit, kind of like a shady porch to a tent that's already there. You can expand a tent. You can't add to a tent on Shabbos. Rav said to Rabbi Chia, you can't put up a tent, right? You can add to one, but you can't start by putting up a tent that wasn't there before. However, you can hang a curtain, the purpose of which is privacy, right? You can't put up partitions to enclose an area, but you can hang a simple curtain if its purpose is not to make an enclosure, which would be construction, but rather just to have some privacy between me and whoever's over there. For privacy, we can hang a curtain, right? We can't make a whole enclosure, but we can hang a curtain between me and the eyes that are over there so that we have some privacy. And we saw that before where Rav and Shmuel were at Shmuel's house. There was a breach in the wall, and Shmuel told his students, go ahead, you can hang, you can put something in the breach, some cloth, a cloak, just for the sake of privacy. We're not trying to fix the fence on Shabbos. We're just putting a cloak there for the sake of privacy, and that's going to be permitted. Rav Sheshes, the son of Rav Edi, said a bridal canopy is okay. So the bridal canopy, very interesting. It's a very steep, kind of like a tent, but it's not a tent, right? Why is this not a tent? So you can drape that cloth over this bed, this narrow bed. It's called a bridal canopy. It doesn't necessarily have to be for the husband and wife. But you can drape the cloth over that bar that hangs across the top of the bed. So long as the top of the bridal canopy is not 1 handbreadth wide, right? The bar that's at the top there has to be narrow, has to be real narrow. If it's 1 handbreadth, so that's considered significant, and now you put a roof over there and 2 sides, it's like you built a tent. But if it's narrower than 1 handbreadth, then you're really just hanging this cloth for the sake of privacy, and you didn't build a tent. This is definitely getting technical. This is definitely like, we're splitting hairs, but the rabbis are saying, okay, we said you can't build a tent. You can put up some cloth for privacy. When does the privacy cloth become a tent that is prohibited? And the answer is if the top is more than 1 handbreadth wide, and in addition, it has to be so steep that within 3 handbreadths of the top, it still can't be 1 handbreadth wide. It really is steep, and it kind of, it can be a little bit of a curve in it so that it's really hanging very narrow at the top for the first 3 handbreadths, because if it became 1 handbreadth wide within 3 handbreadths of the top, that's considered like it is the top. We've seen that within 3 handbreadths, it's as if it's touching, and we just don't want it to be 1 handbreadth wide at the top or within 3 handbreadths of the top. If it is, then we've made a tent, and that would be prohibited on Shabbos. Then it says, Rav Shesha, the son of Rav Edi, said one may wear a stiff felt hat on Shabbos. All right, so the first question is, wait a minute, it said Rav Sheshes, the son of Rav Edi, talked about the bridal canopy, and then Rav Shesha, the son of Rav Edi, said one may wear a stiff hat on Shabbos. Is this the same person? Yes, it is. It's the same person. Rav Sheshes is a wonderful, colorful sage. He was actually blind, but that he never let that get in his way. He was an incredible, gifted scholar with a huge mind and a huge memory and a huge acumen, and it was really one of the favorites of his colleagues. And people would defer very much to Rav Sheshes because he understood the material so well. Why is he called Rav Sheshes sometimes and Rav Sheshes other times? I'm not sure, but it's the same guy. I looked it up. Okay, why is he talking about a hat? We've been talking about tents and creating a tent on Shabbos or not creating a tent on Shabbos. So he says it is permitted to wear a stiff felt hat on Shabbos. So the Gemara, now that he has said that, we had this ruling, says, well, is there another ruling? Answer, yes. There's a Baraisa which says it's prohibited to wear a stiff felt hat on Shabbos. So right away, we're like, well, what's the issue? Why would Rav Shesha says it's permitted to wear a stiff felt hat. The Baraisa says it's prohibited. What is between them? What is the issue that we're discussing? So the first attempt to explain it is, the Baraisa is prohibiting a hat that has a brim which is 1 handbreadth wide. Why? Because we've just seen that the top of a tent is 1 handbreadth wide, so then it's a tent. So if you put on a hat where the brim on each side goes out 1 handbreadth, and that, there's definitely, I own a Panama hat that has a pretty wide brim. When you get to a 3-inch brim, that's pretty common. And you can think of cowboy hats, right, that even have a 4-inch brim. It's not that unusual. And a 4-inch brim, that's going to be a handbreadth. So are we to understand that if your hat has a 4-inch brim, right, it has a 1 handbreadth brim around the outside going around the hat, so therefore you can't wear that hat on Shabbos? But the Gemara says, whoa, wait a minute. If we're going to say that, then we would have to say that if a person has a cloak, right, and it sticks out more than a handbreadth, and you can imagine a cloak like in the Lord of the Rings, where they have a hood, right, and the hood could easily stick out more than a handbreadth in front of a person's face. If that cloth has a little bit of stiffness, right, you could get that kind of a brim. Are we going to say that kind of a cloak is prohibited? How could we say that? It's not a tent, it's clothing. Isn't a hat clothing also? And the Gemara says, yes, a hat is clothing. We do not consider that a hat is like a tent. That is a false understanding of what Rav Sheshes is saying and why he's saying that it is permitted and why the Baraisa is saying it's prohibited. Rather, the issue is if you have a stiff felt hat, the way they were made 2,000 years ago, it's quite possible that such a hat did not have a good, snug fit on one's head. That did not have a good, snug fit on one's head. So what is the issue? The issue is that if a stiff wind comes along and your hat doesn't fit snugly, excuse me, then your hat could fly off your head. That's a problem. Why? Because then you might come to chase your hat. You might chase it outside of your Shabbos Techem. Or more likely, the problem that they were worried about is you might come to pick up your hat and carry it, right? If the wind is blowing so hard that it blew it off your head, once you pick it up, you're not going to put it back on your head. The wind is still blowing. So you might come to walk in a public domain more than 4 cubits carrying your hat, and that is prohibited. That's in fact a biblical prohibition to carry something more than 4 cubits in the public domain on Shabbos. And a person who did that would become liable to bring a sin offering if the temple is standing in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem. So that's what the rabbis are protecting us against. You can't wear a hat on Shabbos that doesn't fit well, because it might blow off your head and you might come to chase it. Now, if you have such a hat and you enjoy wearing it, then you can still wear it if it has a strap. Here's the law of hats on Shabbos. A hat with a brim a handbreadth wide that does not fold over may not be worn on Shabbos, even in the house, as it is considered a tent in accordance with the opinion of Rabbeinu Hananel and others. Wait a minute. Now we're learning that the halacha is such a hat with a wide brim that does not fold over may not be worn. Wait a minute. Let's keep reading the halacha. The custom nowadays is to be lenient with respect to hats, as their brims are not considered stiff, right? So the fact is, a brim that's that's a full handbreadth wide makes your hat into a tent and is not permitted to wear it. However, the commentators, the Gedolim, the authorities, the rabbis who make these rulings have said, we're not going to consider that, even if it is a stiff brim, we're not going to consider it as a stiff brim. We're not going to consider it as a tent. So the custom nowadays is that hats are not considered tents, even though technically, if it had that's very wide brim, it might be considered a tent. So the custom nowadays is to be lenient with respect to hats, as their brims are not considered stiff. This custom, remember it's a custom, not a halacha, relies on Rashi's opinion that a hat does not constitute a tent. Consequently, no objection is raised against those who are lenient in this regard. As for a hat whose brim is less than a handbreadth wide, some authorities prohibit wearing it, as it might be blown off one's head by the wind and he might carry it in a public domain. However, if it fits snugly on one's head, or if it is tied with a strap, it is permitted to wear it in accordance with Rashi's explanation. So there's a case where the law is the law. You can't wear a really wide brim hat because it might be a tent, and you can't wear a hat, that doesn't have a snug fit because it could fly off. However, the law is, the custom is to be quite lenient with this, and we don't go checking out people's hats to see if they can wear it or not. The assumption is they can wear the hat. It's snug enough. A person knows if his hat is in danger of flying off in the wind, and if it is, he should have a strap on it. But what you got to be careful of is that you don't come to carry your hat on Shabbos in a public domain. I'm reminded of the movie Miller's Crossing, the Coen brothers. I believe the first scene of the movie is a hat blowing in the wind. And isn't there a line like, nothing is more ridiculous than a man running after his hat? Okay, well, the sages would agree that not only ridiculous, but prohibited. They don't want that to happen. Okay, that was Mishnah number 12. Now, Mishnahs 13 and 14, they're going to be quick, short Mishnah, short discussion. If you have questions or comments, get them in there now. We're going to be coming to that quite soon. Mishnah 13. One may restore the lower hinge pin of the door of a carriage, box, or cupboard that becomes dislocated to its place on Shabbos in the temple, as this action is prohibited by rabbinic decree, which is not in effect in the temple, but it may not be restored to its place in the rest of the country. And restoring the upper hinge pin is prohibited in both places, as this is considered building and prohibited by Torah law, which applies everywhere. Rabbi Yehuda says, restoring the upper hinge pin to its place is permitted in the temple, while one may restore the lower one to its place, even in the rest of the country. So what are we talking about here? First of all, when they talk about hinges in Talmudic times, they don't have like these two brass plates that fit together and hinge together like this. And so the door has this smooth opening based on, metallic hinges, the way we understand hinges. Rather, what they had was a hinge pin. So the door was just this solid, well-built door. And at the bottom and at the top, it had a peg that stuck out, right? So you can imagine, right, that if this is the door and there was a pin that stuck out here, right? Like, I wasn't prepared to do this, but just imagine, right? So here's a pin on top of the door. Whoops, my magic marker won't stay in place. And then a pin on the bottom, like here, right? And then those pins fit into holes, one in the ground and one in the door frame at the top, and the door swings on those pins. If these pins fall out of place, the door will fall out of the frame, because this is the only thing that's holding the door in the door frame. One pin at the bottom, one pin at the top. You see, over the thousands of years, we figured out a better way to attach a door to a door frame than humanity had 2,000 years ago. So what they're saying here is, if one pin comes out, can it be replaced, right? And so there's going to be a difference between the bottom pin and the top pin. The bottom pin, it's like it could come out easily and you're just kind of shoving it back in place. But if the top pin comes out, that's going to be more simple. Putting it back really is like construction, and that's going to be prohibited. Okay. So there's the difference again, that Rabbi Yehuda is going to be more lenient than the sages. That's the issue. Let's just read the halacha on that. This is how the law came out after all the discussion. If the lower hinge pin of a carriage, a box, or a cupboard comes slightly loose, one may push it back in. If it comes out entirely, one may not put it back on Shabbos, lest he bang it in forcefully. One may not restore the upper hinge pin, even by means of pushing. In the temple, one may restore the lower hinge pin to its place, even if it came out entirely. Right? So the thing for us to remember, I'll tell you what, we have, there's a door in one of our kitchen cabinets that comes loose all the time. I got to do a better job fixing it. So if it's just putting it back in place, no problem. If the screw that holds in that hinge comes out, right? Can I put the screw back in on Shabbos? No way. If it's just kind of out and I could just, gently push it with my thumb, it's really not even, it's not a repair. It's definitely not construction. It's not a new hole. It's nothing like that. If it's just kind of pushing it back in so that the cabinet's not hanging there, maybe it's going to fall, break, whatever, that's going to be a problem. That seems to be okay. But if getting that cabinet door back in its place is going to involve anything no tools, that's for sure. But even with my hands, if it's starting to resemble a repair and banging in the screw and holding it in place, no good. And if we're talking about the upper hinge, don't get involved with that at all, because that's going to be a more elaborate repair once you get started. There's so many jobs, it seems easy, and once you start fixing it, it becomes a 1-hour job and then a 2-hour job. You can't get involved in anything like that on Shabbos. Okay, Mishna number 14, the last Mishna we're going to be talking. This is about bandages. Bandages. One may return to its place a bandage that became detached from a wound on Shabbos in the temple. In the temple, this is not prohibited as a preventive measure, lest one come to spread the ointment and thereby perform the prohibited labor of smoothing. However, one may not return a bandage to its place in the rest of the country. If one sought to apply the bandage for the first time to an untreated wound on Shabbos, it is prohibited in both places. The major issue that has to do with bandages. Okay, now, again, whenever this kind of issue comes up, if somebody's life or health is in serious jeopardy, all these rules go out the window. We do whatever we need to do to save a life. We need to do whatever we need to do to make sure that somebody's life is not endangered, okay? But here we're really talking about, let's say you got some kind of injury, you were hurt on Friday, it was bandaged properly. what happens if the bandage falls off during Shabbos? Now, Rav Yehuda will say, I'll just read the first paragraph of the Gemara. The sages taught in a Baraisa, with regard to a bandage that became detached from a wound, one may return it to its place on Shabbos in all cases. Rabbi Yehuda says, if it slipped downward, one may push it upward. If it slipped upward, one may push it downward. One may also uncover part of the bandage and clean the opening of the wound on one side, and then uncover another part of the bandage and clean the opening of the wound on that side. But the real issue for them is ointment. The problem is, here's what you can't do on Shabbos. You cannot put hand cream on your hands, right? You can't smear ointment, skin cream, any kind of cream on your hands. Now, we talked about, like, if you're doing it for scent, that's a different issue. But the real problem here is that you might come to perform the prohibited labor of smoothing. Smoothing is one of the steps, I believe, in tanning a hide, right? That part of the Mishkan, part of the tabernacle, was made out of the skins of animals. And to prepare those skins, in other words, you have the skin of a cow, eventually it becomes leather, right? How does the skin of a cow with all that hair on it eventually become leather? There's a bunch of different steps, and one of them is smoothing. And if you spread some kind of ointment on your skin, that is considered smoothing, and we don't do that on Shabbos. This question actually just came up for me recently because, on Shabbos, we're praying outdoors in a backyard minyan. It was a sunny day, and I was thinking, can I put on sunblock? I want to put on sunblock on Shabbos. So interestingly, the kind of sunblock that you spread like this, not allowed. Now, if you're a person, who has serious issues with skin cancer, ask your rabbi. I'm not addressing that. But normally speaking, you can't put sunblock on by spreading it on your skin. But if you have spray sunblock, you can do that because now you're not smoothing, you're not smearing. You'd have to kind of be careful that if you spray it on, then you don't then start to, do this. I don't know at what point, just putting a little to make sure that you got coverage there after you sprayed it becomes smoothing. You should talk to your rabbi about that. But you can spray sunblock, you can't smear sunblock. And this issue with bandages, the rabbis prohibited a person to put a new bandage on a wound on Shabbos because they're going to spread ointment, perhaps on the bandage, perhaps on the wound itself, and then we have this problem of smoothing. So this whole discussion, the problem with the bandage is the fear, right? They're protecting us against coming to perform the prohibited labor of smoothing. And that's not going to apply in the temple when the temple is standing, because it's a rabbinic decree, and they don't apply that decree in the temple grounds. The priests can be trusted to know what they can do and not do so that they don't come to violate Torah prohibitions. So where did the halakha come out on this? Uncovering a bandage. It is permitted to uncover a bandage and clean part of the wound, and then uncover a different part of the bandage to clean a different section of the wound in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda. Right? So people who have to clean a wound, like they had a wound, it's a serious wound, they really need to clean it every day. So you can do that. But what you don't want to do is take the bandage off, do the cleaning, put the bandage back. Rather, you want to uncover part of the bandage, do the cleaning, put the bandage back, uncover the other part, do the cleaning, put the bandage back. And that's how we deal with that situation. If the bandage falls off, it is prohibited to remove a bandage from a wound on Shabbos. If one did so intentionally, he is prohibited to restore it to the wound. If the bandage fell onto a utensil, one may restore it. If the bandage fell on the ground, one may not restore it to the wound, in accordance with the respective opinions of Rashi and the Rif. So, if you have to dress the wound on Shabbos, if you have to, clean the wound on Shabbos, don't fully remove the bandage, move it to the side, do what you got to do. Try to leave a little bit covered, then put the bandage back, then uncover the part that you left covered before, clean that, and then replace the bandage. And that seems to be the way we do it, and that's how we protect ourselves from coming to do the prohibited labor of smoothing on Shabbos. That's what I've got for us today. Let us check comments and questions. Sharon Frant Brooks, can you add to the schach on your sukkah on Shabbos? So you're asking because we said we can add to an existing tent, right? Kind of extending it. But when you're talking about the schach of a sukkah, right? So this is we have, what is the schach? The covering of a sukkah, the little booth that we eat and even sleep in, ideally during Sukkot, the fall festival, all week. We take all our meals there. We even try to sleep there if we can. And one of the definitions of the sukkah is that it's got this covering. It's made of natural materials, plant materials, that we can still see through. We can see the stars, but it casts more shade than not. And we really need to have that completed before Sukkot begins. Can we add to that? I'm not sure. That might be a forbidden act of construction, because if you need to add schach to your sukkah, so that part of your sukkah is not kosher, the part that needs schach. And so as you're adding to it, that might be construction. It might also be one of the 39 prohibited labors is called striking the final blow. So when you complete a structure, that in itself is a prohibited labor, and maybe that would come into play here. I'm not sure the answer, so this is definitely not an authoritative answer. But when we get to Tractate Sukkah, so we're definitely going to be talking more about that, all kinds of laws of the Sukkah. Lynn, concerning wound dressings for priests on duty at the temple, I thought a priest who has been disfigured or wounded is not to perform the service. It is definitely true that a priest who has been disfigured becomes disqualified from performing the service. Does a wound that occurs on Shabbos, does that disqualify? Because we do bring offerings on Shabbos. Does a wound disqualify? We're going to be talking about that too when we get there. More in there's many laws of offerings that we're going to be studying. So what rises to the level of a disfigurement that would disqualify? Like a scrape, I don't think is going to do it. Losing a hand or a limb or finger, that probably will do it. But I'm not sure. I have not prepared those laws to discuss tonight. Good question, though. Lucy, doesn't it make a difference that you are not having any intention of smoothing anything, just taking care of a wound or preventing a sunburn? See, I think in this case, it is smoothing, right? Because the act of smoothing as part of the tanning process is spreading a substance over, that skin. It's not human skin, right? It's the animal skin. But since you're here doing the same action of spreading this, this liquid, some kind of ointment, some kind of oil, whatever it is, over skin, it really is smoothing. You're not doing it for the purpose of preparing that skin, for some other use, unless, you're that serial killer. And what was that movie? Silence of the Lambs, right? Forget I even mentioned that. But, if you're a normal person, obviously that's not your intention. However, the action that you're performing is close enough. And that's why the sages have this law. And indeed, it is still the law today. It's a good question, though, right? Because according to Rabbi Shimon, unintended consequences, we're not liable for them. But as long as it's not inevitable, right? And this would be the inevitable consequence of spreading ointment on your skin. And that seems to be why it's prohibited. Janice says, I really appreciate these informative classes. Thank you, Sal and Nina, for all your efforts to present them. Thank you, Janice. Much appreciated. Some people have been asking about my shirt. So this is our special Hanukkah merchandise. I got to say, this shirt is incredibly comfortable. I love it. I love wearing it. It's available at shop.accidentaltalmudist.org. All the profits of the store go to support our nonprofit. And we are entering our year-end fundraiser. You're going to be hearing more about that. it is very important, right? We cannot produce this content without the support of our donors. It takes time, it takes money, it takes staff, it takes admin, it takes marketing, it takes production. What we do is it's a full-time job for us and for our assistant and for all the people who are involved with us, our web developers, etc. All of that costs money. We are a nonprofit. So if you go to donate.accidentaltalmudist.org and you contribute to our nonprofit, then you partner with us in bringing Torah to the world. We're sharing more Jewish wisdom with more people at Accidental Talmudist than perhaps any other organization is doing online in the world. So every dollar you donate has a tremendous impact and is a big merit to you and your family and whoever you dedicate your donation to. Donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Go there, contribute, become our partner in bringing the light of Torah to the whole world. That's what I've got for us tonight. Tomorrow is Friday. Very early. Shabbos starts very early this time of year. We're 2 weeks away from the earliest Shabbat of the year. But on Fridays, our time is always the same, 12 Pacific. We'll be studying with God's help at page 103, then 104 on Shabbos, and 105 we make the Siyum on Sunday. We're really making progress. It's great to learn with you, my holy sisters and brothers. Have a great night and a great Shabbos.